In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a single oil tanker became the most dangerous object on Earth. One wrong move could trigger a war between two nuclear superpowers. As American warships closed in and Russian forces raced to reclaim what they called stolen property, the world watched in silence. What happened aboard that tanker would decide whether diplomacy survived or history repeated its darkest mistakes. The Russian-flagged oil tanker drifted through the gray waters of the Atlantic like a condemned prisoner being led to its fate. Two United States Navy destroyers cut through the waves on either side of it, their radar systems locked, their missile tubes sealed but ready. On the deck of the tanker, United States Coast Guard officers stood in a tight formation, rifles slung across their chests, eyes scanning the endless horizon for any sign of approaching danger. The ship had been seized under American sanctions law, accused of secretly transporting oil for a network that Washington had labeled illegal. To the American government, it was a law enforcement operation. To Russia, it was piracy carried out by a rival superpower. Inside the tanker bridge, the Russian captain sat quietly, his hands resting on the control panel, watching the American escort ships on the radar screen. He knew that every mile they traveled toward an American port was another mile that Moscow would never forgive. Messages were already flying between capitals. In Washington, officials spoke of legal authority and international compliance. In Moscow, officials spoke of sovereignty and humiliation. Neither side was willing to step back. As the tanker continued westward, unseen beneath the waves, an American nuclear submarine shadowed the convoy, while thousands of kilometers away, Russian naval commanders began plotting their response. The Atlantic Ocean, vast and empty to most of the world, had suddenly become the narrowest place on Earth. One vessel, one legal dispute, and two nuclear powers were now moving on a collision course that no one fully controlled. In a fortified command room deep beneath Moscow, digital maps of the Atlantic glowed on massive screens as Russian naval officers studied every movement of the seized tanker. The ship was marked in red, slowly sliding westward under American control, and to the men in the room it felt like watching a piece of their own country being dragged away. The Russian defense minister stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, while analysts reported satellite data, weather conditions, and the positions of United States warships escorting the vessel. This was no longer just about oil or sanctions. It was about whether Russia would allow another nation to publicly take what flew its flag. Orders were drafted, revised, and rewritten as the Kremlin weighed the risks. A direct attack would mean war. Doing nothing would mean weakness. In the end, Moscow chose a third path, one designed to project strength without firing the first shot. A naval task force from the Northern Fleet was ordered to sail into the Atlantic. Officially, the mission was to protect Russian citizens and property. Unofficially, it was a message to Washington that Russia was prepared to challenge the seizure at sea. Warships were fueled, missiles loaded, and crews briefed under strict secrecy. The captains were told to expect close contact with American forces but to avoid opening fire unless absolutely necessary. The goal was pressure, not destruction. As the fleet began its long journey south, diplomats were sent to deliver formal protests to the United States, accusing it of violating international maritime law. The Kremlin wanted the world to see Russia as the victim of aggression, even as its warships moved quietly toward confrontation. In Washington, intelligence agencies quickly detected the Russian deployment. What had been a legal seizure was now evolving into a high-stakes naval standoff. The tanker continued to sail, unaware that two nations were aligning steel and firepower around it, and that the next few days could decide whether the Atlantic would remain a highway of trade or become a battlefield between giants. As the Russian naval task force pushed deeper into the Atlantic, the invisible distance between Moscow and Washington began to shrink. Satellites tracked every wake, every course change, every acceleration. In the command centers of the United States Navy, analysts watched the Russian ships inch closer to the seized tanker and its American escorts. What had once been thousands of kilometers of ocean now felt like a narrow corridor where every maneuver could be misread as hostile. On the decks of the American destroyers, sailors were briefed on the situation, told to remain calm, to follow rules of engagement with absolute discipline, and to prepare for anything. Their ships were powerful, but power meant little if one wrong action turned tension into bloodshed. The Russian fleet was no less prepared. Its captains had orders to shadow, to intimidate, and to demonstrate that Russia would not surrender its property quietly. They ran drills on boarding operations, electronic warfare, and emergency damage control, all while maintaining radio silence. The tanker, slow and heavy, became the center of a tightening circle of steel. Above it, reconnaissance aircraft from both nations swept the skies. Below it, submarines glided silently, tracking each other with sonar pings that never quite revealed their full positions. Every commander involved knew the unspoken truth. If a missile was fired or a ship was hit, the political consequences would be irreversible. That knowledge made every decision heavier. Meanwhile, media outlets around the world began to report on the growing standoff, though few understood how close it truly was to breaking. Markets trembled, oil prices spiked, and governments quietly prepared for the worst. The Atlantic, which had carried centuries of trade and migration, now carried something far more dangerous: the weight of two nuclear powers daring each other to blink. The tanker kept moving, its engines humming steadily, but its journey had become a countdown to either a humiliating retreat for one side or a global crisis that no one could contain. Radio frequencies above the Atlantic filled with coded signals and terse warnings as the Russian warships closed to within visual range of the American escort group. On the bridge of a United States destroyer, officers listened to Russian voices crackle through their headsets, each message carefully worded but heavy with implied threat. The Americans responded with equal formality, reminding the Russians that the tanker was under lawful seizure and that any interference would be considered hostile. Neither side raised their voices, yet the tension was so thick it seemed to vibrate through the air. Sailors on both fleets stood at their stations, staring across the water at ships that could become enemies in an instant. The tanker remained in the middle, a massive floating target that no one wanted to see damaged, yet everyone was prepared to fight over. Diplomatic channels were burning as fast as the radios. In Washington, officials argued that the operation was backed by court orders and international sanction regimes. In Moscow, leaders insisted that no foreign power had the right to confiscate a Russian vessel on the high seas. Both narratives were being broadcast to the world, but the truth was that law had become secondary to power. As the Russian ships drew closer, American radar locked on them, and Russian electronic warfare systems began to probe the American defenses. It was a silent duel, invisible to civilians but terrifying to those who understood it. One glitch, one misinterpreted signal, could trigger automatic responses that no human could stop in time. Yet despite the danger, neither fleet backed down. They circled each other like wary predators, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Overhead, the sky darkened as clouds rolled in, adding a layer of uncertainty to an already fragile situation. The Atlantic was no longer just water and wind. It had become a narrow stage where the future of global stability was being rehearsed by men who knew how easily it could all fall apart. The Atlantic became a black mirror as night swallowed the convoy, broken only by the faint glow of navigation lights and the ghostly shapes of warships moving through the dark. From the Russian fleet, fast attack boats slipped into the water, their engines barely above a whisper as they cut across the waves toward the tanker. Above them, a pair of helicopters lifted off, flying low and slow, using the clouds as cover. Inside those helicopters, Russian naval commandos sat in silence, gripping their weapons and harnesses, knowing that the next few minutes could decide whether the world stayed at peace or slid toward disaster. On the American destroyers, radar screens suddenly bloomed with new contacts. The alert was passed quietly but urgently. American Coast Guard teams aboard the tanker moved into defensive positions, their eyes straining through night vision goggles to catch any movement on the water. The tension was unbearable. No one wanted to be the first to fire, but everyone knew that once Russian boots touched the deck, the situation would become almost impossible to control. The helicopters drew closer, their rotors chopping the air as the attack boats spread out below them. Russian commanders believed that if they could reach the tanker without killing anyone, Washington would hesitate to respond with force. The Americans believed that if they allowed the boarding, the credibility of their entire operation would collapse. Radio channels exploded with warnings, each side telling the other to stand down. The tanker continued to plow forward through the dark, a massive, slow-moving prize that could not escape what was coming. As the first Russian boat came within a few hundred meters, American weapon systems tracked it automatically, waiting for a human hand to give the final command. In that frozen moment, the fate of two superpowers rested on the discipline and restraint of men who had been trained for war but now prayed they would not have to begin one. The Russian boats moved closer, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the rolling Atlantic, while the helicopters hovered just beyond the edge of the tanker's lights. On the bridge of the American destroyer, the commanding officer watched the range numbers tick downward, each one another step toward a point of no return. His orders were clear yet painfully vague. He was to protect the seized vessel without provoking a war. On the tanker itself, Coast Guard teams took cover behind steel railings and cargo containers, weapons trained on the approaching shapes. Sweat ran down faces despite the cold night air. They were not facing pirates or smugglers. They were facing soldiers of a nuclear-armed state. Russian commanders believed they were walking a narrow but survivable path. If their men boarded the ship and took control without bloodshed, they could force the United States into a humiliating diplomatic retreat. They did not intend to fire unless they were fired upon, but they were ready to fight if they had to. The radios crackled with overlapping voices, warnings in English and Russian blending into a chaotic chorus. Every word carried the weight of potential catastrophe. A single misunderstood phrase or a single nervous finger could ignite a chain reaction that no leader could stop. The distance between the first Russian boat and the tanker was now less than a football field. American targeting systems followed it with perfect precision, ready to unleash overwhelming force if ordered. Yet no one gave that order. In Washington and Moscow, leaders stared at live feeds, aware that history was unfolding in real time. They knew that if this moment ended in gunfire, it would not stay confined to one ship in the Atlantic. It would echo through alliances, markets, and battlefields around the world. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath as two nations stood on the very edge of something they had spent decades trying to avoid. Time stretched in a way that felt unnatural as the Russian boats slowed to a crawl just short of the tanker's hull. The waves lapped softly against steel, a cruel contrast to the violence everyone was prepared to unleash. Through night vision lenses, American guards could see the outlines of Russian commandos gripping ladders, ready to climb. On the Russian side, operators watched American silhouettes on the deck, rifles raised, fingers tense on triggers. Both groups were trained professionals, yet even the best training could not erase the human fear of being the first to die. Orders were being relayed up the chain of command on both sides, but the speed of events was now faster than politics. In Moscow, officials argued whether pushing forward would force Washington to retreat. In Washington, leaders debated whether allowing the boarding would undermine every sanction and every promise they had made. No one wanted to blink, yet everyone understood the cost of not blinking. The Atlantic, once just water and wind, now felt like the most dangerous place on Earth. A helicopter drifted closer, its spotlight briefly illuminating the tanker's deck and the faces of the men waiting there. For an instant, Russians and Americans locked eyes across the gap, realizing how thin the line between them had become. The smallest sound, a dropped piece of equipment or a nervous cough, could be mistaken for the start of an attack. Automatic defense systems stood ready to respond faster than any human could think. In that frozen moment, the future of global stability was no longer in the hands of presidents or diplomats, but in the discipline of sailors and commandos staring at each other in the dark. Seconds passed. Then more seconds. Each one felt like a lifetime, stretching the nerves of everyone involved to their breaking point. Just as the Russian commandos prepared to move, a sudden burst of white light tore through the darkness above the tanker. An American flare shot into the sky, exploding into a blazing orb that turned night into day. The sea, the ships, and the faces of the men on both sides were suddenly exposed, leaving nowhere to hide. It was not a weapon, but it was a message that could not be ignored. The Americans were drawing a final line, telling the Russians that any further movement would be seen by everyone and answered immediately. On the Russian boats, commanders shouted for their men to hold position. The helicopters hovered uncertainly, their pilots now painfully aware that every move was being watched and recorded. In Washington, the flare was seen on live video feeds, and officials understood exactly what it meant. The United States was signaling that it was prepared to escalate if necessary, but it was also offering one last chance to step back without losing face. In Moscow, the Kremlin faced a brutal calculation. Pushing forward now would almost certainly lead to bloodshed and possibly a wider war. Pulling back would be humiliating, but it would keep the conflict from spiraling out of control. The flare burned brightly as it drifted down, its light reflected in the waves like a dying star. For a few seconds, it was the only thing anyone could see. Then it began to fade, and with it came the moment of decision. The Russian boats slowly eased off their throttles, holding their position but no longer advancing. The helicopters climbed a little higher, creating distance where there had been none. The tanker remained under American control, at least for now, as the world waited to see if this fragile pause would hold. As the light from the flare finally disappeared into the dark Atlantic, something just as important replaced it: restraint. The Russian command boats began to turn away, their engines growing louder as they put distance between themselves and the tanker. Above them, the helicopters slowly pulled back toward their fleet, abandoning the attempt to board. On the decks of the American ships, men did not cheer or relax. They simply exhaled, some for the first time in many minutes, as the realization set in that they were not about to become the spark of a global war. In Washington, senior officials watched the Russian withdrawal in silence, knowing how close they had come to catastrophe. In Moscow, leaders issued carefully worded statements, claiming they had demonstrated Russia's resolve while avoiding unnecessary escalation. Both sides would spin the outcome for their own audiences, but the truth was far simpler. Two nuclear powers had stared each other down and chosen not to cross the final line. The tanker continued its slow journey toward an American port, still a legal and diplomatic battlefield even though the guns had fallen silent. Around the world, markets stabilized, and governments quietly canceled emergency meetings that had been called in fear of a wider conflict. Yet the lesson of the night would not be forgotten. Everyone involved knew that the underlying tensions remained, and that the next incident might not end so quietly. The Atlantic returned to its role as a highway of commerce, but beneath its waves lingered the memory of how close it had come to becoming a battlefield. History would record that no shots were fired, but those who were there would remember the fear, the waiting, and the understanding that the fate of millions had rested on the restraint of a few men in the dark.